Alrighty, welcome to Podium Time. We are in our season of building back audiences, and today we are joined by David Taylor. David, thank you so much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm so excited to be here.
Great. Could you give us and our listeners a brief overview of who you are and what you do?
Yes, it's quite a complicated job, so this is my best shot at it. I'm David Taylor. I'm based in the UK, and I'm passionate about helping people and organisations in the music world thrive in the modern age. So that's a mixture of coaching and consulting, both for students, people who are in the profession, musicians, conductors, and also orchestras, operas, arts organisations, everyone big to small. And it's quite a privilege to be able to work with such a range of people. But I'm totally fascinated with how we connect with people in the 21st century, how we innovate and change, and all the reasons as to why we've not been able to change in the past, even though that the world is an ever-changing place.
Yeah, I think the best part of that is in the modern world, because I
Yeah,
mean, as all our listeners, as you know, or we tend to run maybe a century or two back, and the
Just a
fact
little bit.
just a tad.
orchestras just starting to post on social media happened only a couple years ago, and just starting to like figure out how to actually do it correctly is starting to happen now. So thanks so much for being here again. We want to talk about how we can move orchestras, like you said, into the modern age and really thrive, rather than just like how can we just not close our doors now that we're not totally out of the pandemic, but we're definitely on our way out. Things are starting to get back. We're having regular seasons and in-person concerts. So because I said the theme of the season is building back audiences, what does that what comes to mind when you hear that?
For me, there's two sides of the coin for this. The first is trying to attract new audiences, which has been an ever-present conversation for the last few years, even pre-pandemic, that we need to get new audiences in, just for making sure we've got a consumer base going forwards, but also in an ideal world, why would you not want to expand to new audiences and get more customers and connect to more people and the benefits of making a difference to more people's lives? So on one side is that sort of relatively traditional conversation of new audiences. But in the post-pandemic age, I think it's really fascinating that building back audiences is that our previous audiences are not there anymore in the same way. We're seeing big drop-offs in audiences, and apologies for the UK reference that is now about to come in, but the Premier League, which is the top league in the UK, or in the English Soccer League, they've come back with record-breaking audience figures. Glastonbury Music Festival in the UK, again, record-breaking audience figures. And yet in the classical music world, we're seeing significant drop-offs. We are not back to like pre-pandemic levels, despite the fact that sport, entertainment, and other things are certainly bouncing back better than they were before. So I think for me, the other side of that coin is working out why our previous audiences aren't coming back in the way they were before, which is also a really fascinating thing to dig into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been challenging people to define what audience we're talking about, because the audience that we've been so used to attracting, which is just the same couple hundred subscribers and maybe bringing in families once for a movie concert, like that's not sustainable anymore. And it was barely sustainable before our world got rocked.
Totally agree. And I think we're almost seeing the consequences, or even the residue of our bad output pre-pandemic. In essence, the pandemic has just been like a circuit breaker, and we're now only seeing the consequences of years of systemic under-involvement and under-valuing of how we market, how we connect to people, and how we adapt as a product. And I think things like sports are always really fascinating to look at. Going back to the Premier League, there was in the 90s, they were bought out by Sky Sports, and all of a sudden there were cheerleaders and fireworks and like additional things that came along with it that weren't actually the main thing, but that really helped propel it to having a significantly higher value and turnover. Similarly with the NFL, that's also been another one where there's been an investment in money and entertainment that goes alongside. Our product hasn't really changed since realistically since we decided to start turning the lights down during concerts. Apart from that, and maybe concert programs, there's not really been that many innovations in the last 120, 30, 40, 50 years. So I think we've been quite accustomed to not changing, and as a result, there's then like a systemic resistance to change, and that's now what we're seeing the harsh consequences of going forwards.
Yeah, yeah, it's really hitting a lot of groups. But if there's a time to change, this is the time. And the information is out there. Like the skills that we need to build are there. Other people have figured it out. It's just that so people have figured it out for orchestras and what to do with them.
Totally agree. And there's so many fantastic stories from other industries that you can really pull on for inspiration. I think less so in the United States, but the more funding you get from organizations means that there's less of a need to change or be curious about the outsider world. And in essence, if you were getting £2 million a year from, or $2 million a year from a government organization, you think that would be like a safety net to go out and do weird stuff. But in reality, it's meant that people are just being rewarded for their bad outputs, for want of a better phrase. They're being rewarded for not thinking outside the box, for not evolving, for not doing better. And as a result, there's not really that necessity that has driven change for many other organizations in the past. So I think in America, there's certainly more of an impetus for that, but equally the traditional donor model means that if you're pleasing those few people, you're not necessarily taking care of the future as well. So there's that potential balance of how do you find the need for change when you are rewarded for not changing.
Yeah. What strikes me is it's not just that there's no incentive to search out. It's that, and we've had this idea that the incentive actually is to stay in our lane and don't change, because people think if we change too much, we're going to lose our base and then we'll be gone. But that's just as risky, if not more risky, especially when it's not working anymore.
Totally. And when it's been like that for such a long period of time, it's not just that we're incentivized, it's now our inherent engraved culture. Like this has been not like a 10-year incentive. This is 50, 60 years of culture we need to change within organizations, and actually on a global industry level that we need to start being curious about this. So it is quite hard to change those mindsets, to help people see alternatives, or just generally be curious about what the alternatives could be. And it's not, I don't think it's that people are in a bad place with it, because they obviously care that they want to go forwards, and they feel that change would be a threat in some cases. But one of my absolute favorite books and also absolute favorite films is Moneyball, going into baseball now. So I'm definitely going back onto the US analogies. But there's a great phrase in there, which is adapt or die. And I think we're now very much at that point, and this should be like the bells ringing on the Titanic, like problems are happening, we need to do something. And the longer we procrastinate having a conversation about this, the worse it's going to get.
Mm-hmm. So let's start that conversation. And maybe you'll know where to start that better than we will. What is it that you lead orchestras to do when you see somebody struggling and they ask you to help them? What are the first couple things that you look at?
Really fascinating question. So I think there's two sides that I look at, but it always comes down to one core thing. So the two sides are how they connect to people in the digital world and how they connect to people outside of the concert hall. Mm-hmm. And the other would be how they connect to people inside the concert hall. But the main thing that brings that all together for me is human relationships. And we should be completely ignoring absolutely everything else that we do, purely for the sole goal of building strong relationships with people. And once you have that connection and relationship, you can get people to donate to you, you can get them to come to concerts, you can get them to be ambassadors for you. Everything opens up at that point. So for me, that is the sole goal of what we should be doing, and also the key problem that we haven't realized that is the main challenge that we face. For me, a lot of what I do is working in the digital side of things. So if I'm being brutally honest, a lot of basic best practice when it comes to social media is really fascinating. One of my pet peeves is multi-million-pound arts organizations still putting really long links in Instagram, which you can't click on and it doesn't work. So why would you waste your time doing it? Especially when you can Google 5 tips for making Instagram better and you can find out within a second. But again, like that idea of like, how do we actually not use social media for advertising? No one picks up their phone to look on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok to see a bombardment of adverts saying, come to my thing, come to my thing. So for me, it's trying to identify how do we change that round? How do you build relationships through digital means? How can you give content and value to people? And that's usually where I start off with organizations. A lot of it as well, the problem tends not to be necessarily the ideas, but more the working practice behind it. So actually delving into how the organization works, what challenges there are, and I'm yet to find two organizations that work in the same way. So that's always quite a fun challenge to dig into.
Mhm.
But then also on the concert side, like how can we not just have it that someone turns up, sits down, listens for a while, gets up and leaves, and it's utterly passive? How can we make that into an experience that is not only emotive and can build connections, but they can also share with others and they can be empowered to be ambassadors and advocates for?
So let's start with inside the concert hall, because that's where we already are, even if we don't have a presence outside of it. What are some of those things?
Yeah, so there's lots, and this is going to be in varying levels of disruption. So do you have a preference for starting with most disruptors or least disruptive?
Maybe let's start easy. Let's start with least.
Start easy. Cool.
Let's
So
ramp it up.
exactly. So we'll go for things outside the actual performance experience itself. With events, we really only provide a primary experience. So you turn up and there is a performance, and that's the only thing that we offer. One of my great loves is rugby. And so when I've gone to watch the national team play rugby, there's multiple levels of experience when you go to watch a game. So when you arrive outside the stadium, there is a tertiary, a third level of experience. And you arrive, and there are ex-internationals coaching junior rugby that you can go and watch who are playing TIG. There are champagne tents, there's brass bands, there's food, there's challenges that you can do with the balls and like do skill things, and there's a whole third ring of this experience. Then you go into the stadium itself, and there's a secondary ring of experience, which is more bars and food, social media going around with these giant screens going around the whole thing, fireworks, dancing, all these other things. But ultimately, everyone goes for a primary experience, which is a world-class performance on a stage by elite people. That's kind of the same for us. We go for a primary world-class experience on a stage by amazing elite performers, but we don't really have anything else to back it up. And I have a theory that we're not competing for value for money, we're competing for value for time. And that when you have 2.5 to 3 hours on a Friday or Saturday night, what's the best use of your time? And realistically, that even though we are in like recession territory, people still are focusing on that rather than the money side of things. And for us, we have a performance, and then maybe a really naff long queue for an interval drink, maybe a pre-concert talk, and that's the only thing we've really added. So to come full circle to what we can do, I think it's adding things to those tertiary and secondary experiences. So this idea that the concert starts not when the first note starts, but not even when they step into the building, but when they see the building or when they have that first touch point with you as an organization. So that could be on a simple thing, pre-concert wine tasting, a series of different musical talks you can go to. So not just the hardcore Schenkerian analysis of like the uber nerd thing, which is nothing knocking it at all, but that's for one type of people. And equally, you could have like a complete beginner's guide or a pre-interview chat with musicians, an area to try out instruments for the first time, an exploratory area, art films, information, all those other things. And so for me, that's probably the easiest thing we can do to really play with the idea of what is a concert without touching any of the experience of what the concert or the performance side of the concert is. So that means the music still isn't touched, the environment isn't touched, but we're adding more to the evening as a whole to make it more valuable. For me, the benefit or the things that are most powerful are the things that have personalities and that ability to build connections. So anything with musicians, speaking, connections. There's a UK orchestra called the Philharmonia who are based in London. They launched a gin during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the idea of having like a pre-concert gin tasting with the musicians who are there to build those connections is fantastic. There's an orchestra in the Netherlands who I can never remember the name of, but they did pre-concert speed. I think speed networking would be a more polite term than speed dating. But it was so as many members of the audience got to meet as many members of the orchestra as possible. And therefore, all of a sudden, it's like, oh, it's not just a performance. It's a performance by like John, who I know and had like a 5-minute chat to. So I think they're the really exciting things we can really play around with, where trying to identify what our audience like and then reverse engineering what could be of value or of interest to them to really sort of make the experience in the evening more valuable. So that would be the less provocative one. The more provocative is then what can we do with inside the hall to start changing stuff around? And
during our main course, you mean?
Exactly, yeah. So again, there's different levels. There could be in the hall itself, but not when the music is playing, and then in the hall itself, but when the music is playing. that's then quite difficult to do. But stuff whether it is then ludicrous like augmented reality concerts where you can hold up your phone and see information. Digital concert program notes are fantastic, especially if they are the ones that are synced to the music. I'm a huge fan of those. I've also had some great success implementing live social media engagement during concerts. And that was with a huge screen above the orchestra. And it wasn't as crazy as you think by the sound of that, where it was like a live feed going around while they were playing. But they were encouraged pre-concert to take photos and engage on social media during the performance on this hashtag, and that it would be showed at the interval and at the end of the concert. And then all of a sudden they could see their likes and comments in the same way it was at the sports stadium to see their engagements coming around. And my favorite story from doing it once was with a youth orchestra, and two families from different sides of the hall realized they were taking photos of the same children. And so they connected on social media. A whole year went by, and for the next concert 12 months later, both families went for dinner before the same concert. So they found their own community in a way that was probably impossible before. We're not really very good within our concert format or as a whole for actually having community opportunities. So that was one of my sort of more fascinating things. So there's a lot you can do inside, but I know that in some cases that's quite a sacred environment, and getting both musicians, performers and organizations on board to be a part of that's quite difficult, and also audiences when they don't want to have that touched as well. So that would be the more provocative side of things.
Yeah. Okay. Lot to think about there.
Sorry, that was the long one.
No, that was perfect. I love that. Well, a couple of things stand out to me. Maybe starting at the end is that we can become a place where other people can build community, and that happens a little. That happens in the cliques and the people who already know each other, and the stereotypical rich people who know all their other rich people meeting before the concert, and it's a social thing. They don't actually care about the concert. Like, there's that stereotype. But I love the idea of using, because so often we just sit and do the concert, and maybe some people could meet by accident, but actually enabling that and encouraging that is a really fascinating way to think about it, to create those connections rather than just the experience of seeing the concert, but actually to create those connections. And that's something you can do with the various pre-concert lectures, or like you were saying with the speed dating with the musicians, which is a really cool idea.
Even something as you mentioned, like having the instrument farm, there before the symphony. I've spoken to a lot of people who, everyone jokes that like, oh, you're just blowing air in your horn, or you're just pulling a bow across the thing. It's not that hard. I think having that interactive experience where you can go and kind of see almost like the gymnastics that are involved in playing these instruments for yourself before you set foot in the hall, it creates that like personal connection where you're like, oh wow, okay, I've held that instrument, I know what that feels like, and look at how fast they're playing. Wow, it kind of like makes it a little bit more real and a little bit more personal of an experience versus just, yep, there's a lady playing the violin on the stage, but never having held that physically for yourself and seeing what that's like. There's a misconnection there that really could open the door for someone's curiosity.
Totally. And a brand new idea off the back of what you were saying. So thank you for the inspiration. Taking the idea of the rugby scenario where there were these little challenges of like throwing as many balls through a hoop as possible. Why not have like a brass challenge of like, you must blow a note for as long as possible and have a scoreboard? And then you realize that you can only do it for 10 seconds, but my God, that person's doing it for like 45. How on earth can they do it? This superhuman. And then also like you can have a score table, and then like that level of investment or understanding, it breaks things down in a way that's really fascinating. I think there's, as you say, there's so much that can be done to really explore that and give you an understanding, not from being told in a lecture format, but from really getting your hands onto an instrument and trying and understanding that, well, like a violin under your neck for more than 5 seconds is really quite painful. And what does it actually look like? And yeah, just more touch points for people to really understand and engage. And a conversation I kept, or a theme I kept having in conversations with chief execs who run orchestras, was that audiences come to our concerts because they love our musicians. And realistically, we're really crap at showing who our musicians are, or finding any touch points for connecting to them in any way, shape, or form. They're a black and white anonymous blob on stage, and they disappear, and then we never actually know who they are or anything. And if you've got a concert program, there's no chance you can work out which name is which person anyway. But this way, like things like that, you get to like, oh, that's the person who showed me how to like blow a note, or to do percussion or snare roll, all these different things. And like I think going full circle back to this being a podcast about conducting, there is so much fascination about what a conductor does, which is of huge value and huge interest. And anything that can share that or demonstrate it or explain it or have those touch points, I think is really fascinating. And I'd say conductors are by far the biggest ambassadors for the orchestra, and that role has changed over time from what was mysterious maestro culture to being full-on ambassador culture. Like you have to be a figurehead of organization now. There was one orchestra I was talking to recently where, I have to be careful how I say this because you can probably work out who it is if you're that much of a detective. But their conductor isn't on any form of social media and is one of those people who lives outside of technology, and they'd just been appointed. And the conversation in the orchestra was that we want them to do social media. How do we do this for them? And realistically, like that's never going to work. And also, why would you appoint someone who's not going to connect to audiences for you? Like it's not a 1970s orchestra. This is a 2020s orchestra. Of course, they should have social media. It makes complete sense. We have to have those touch points for people, and that's where we build relationships. Going way back to your point about there we go. Instrument experiments. So like displaying those illusions around conducting, helping people try that could be a really fascinating way of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I mean, even like, showing an example of like, what does a conductor do? Have an audience before a concert, put some music, like some basic rhythms up and try to have them clap, and all of a sudden it's like trying to get an entire room of people to do the same thing all of a sudden becomes a really big challenge. And so right there, you're able to demonstrate that, there might be music on a page and we all might have the same music, but getting everybody together to do that simultaneously together with complete accuracy is not something that just anybody can do, and it takes a lot of work, and there is a purpose to that beyond just waving a stick and looking cool.
Yeah, that's the reason you get into it, is to look cool, but then all the other things but yeah, like again, like another way of getting those touch points, I think I love the idea of rhythms, and that's a wonderful way of doing it. Another idea from you hearing you talking, like for me, if I was young or even if I was old, and the idea of learning about conducting and trying, but with like a quartet of musicians in front of me and going, I did stuff. I knew what happened when like I moved my arm and they did things, and I could go and tell my friends about that. And God, that's a meaningful experience. And every time I go back, I will see those musicians. So yeah, I think anything that is just like, I think we're an industry that doesn't really experiment or try things out and just see how it goes. And a lot of the ideas we've just like bounced off are low cost or free. And why would we not want to just do weird stuff and see like how we can really sort of share our craft and our passion and our music with others?
Yeah, well, we keep it all behind the screen. Like everything's a rehearsal, and we get it perfect, and then we come out and we don't make any mistakes.
Exactly.
And it's just, I mean, that's just a part of our art. I mean, like the opposite is Andy Warhol. Like just his like totally emotional, not technical, throwing paint is the exact opposite of what we tend to do. But that's, I mean, maybe that's because we have to be so technical to allow the emotion and the connection to be done well. But I mean, as conductors, we have the ability to talk from the stage, and musicians just never, even just having musicians talk from the stage would make such a difference, because you're right, they're up on the stage, they're separated, and then they leave.
Yeah.
And then they come back on, and then they leave.
I'd go as far, like this is definitely deliberately provocative, but I'd say go as far to say as that's rude. And can you imagine a band going out and like be like, and just silence, not saying like hello Glastonbury or like hello LA or like not a word, and just playing and walking off and assuming you applause? It's mad. So I don't see why we do it now, and especially when like the environment we have isn't our historical environment. If we had period audiences in the same way of period performances, they would be raucous, there'd be shouting, there'd be people throwing glasses on the stage, it'd be absolute carnage. So it's strange that we've created this like
That's artificial.
It's
It's
like a
not
snow
human.
globe. Yeah, it really isn't. So I know I'm like deliberately on one side of the spectrum where it is like there are no rules, everything's up for grabs. But I think anything that just humanizes our experience, and why would you not want to talk to your audience, is mad. And again, going back to the idea of the conductors, speaking is now such a huge part of the role, which it never was historically, even 20 years ago, I'd say. Like the ability to speak to children, to adults, to donors, which is also another part of the role now, to media. It's a huge skill. And I think we don't give enough credit for the fact that it is a skill that you learn, you can get better at, and people just assume that you're like either a magician at these things and you can do all of them, or you'll never be able to speak to someone ever. So yeah, I think that's a really fascinating part that how that role's changed. I'd probably say that's changed more than any other role in the orchestra. Actually, I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
I did a workshop with a conductor when I first started conducting, and he said that uh, the job was 10% conducting and 90% networking. And, it's crazy to think about the fact that that's kind of the reality of the situation, though, especially nowadays, is that you do have to spend so much time, like, as you said, social media, having a presence on social media and knowing how to navigate all that, that's a marketable skill that's, looked at and kind of expected of younger conductors these days, and that has nothing to do with music at all.
Totally. Orchestras are quite easy to work out, and venues are quite easy to work out when you sort of boil everything down to its finest point, which is they want to make money and they want to sell tickets. And those are potentially different things because the idea of having donors is a big part of that. So anything that you can do that can demonstrate value that helps them on their journey of making money is going to be of huge value, whether it is donors, media prestige, working with young people because that attracts funding from foundations and things, all these different things, or being a box office hit and being able to like bring audiences in is a huge part. So I think that's now got to be a consideration, and you don't necessarily have to have all of those, but making sure that you're aware of developing the skills to be able to do some, or if not just one of those, is going to be, I think, a huge value to be able to demonstrate value, because there are enough really, really good conductors out there. So actually the ability to like define like who you are, how you provide value to that orchestra, and why you're the right person for that orchestra, I think is really important going forwards.
Yeah. Can you share some things that you've tried that didn't quite work?
Yeah. I'm going to have a think, because I'm one of the sort of person who rolls with the punches quite well and tends not to think backwards. So it's not that I haven't done things and haven't tried. It's I've got a lot better at just shaking it off. Yes. So my weird journey into all of this was running a youth orchestra. And that was created from scratch. And we were really good at being successful of getting a lot of media coverage and different things. But one of our recruitment tools was to put on like a masterclass series. And the idea that these masterclasses were free, people could come, and that would be like, you've now discovered us, aren't we amazing? You should come and join our orchestra. And for love or money, I could not get anyone to come to these things. And like, one of them was with like a very famous clarinetist, and that was like getting blood out of a stone to get anyone to go to it. And I think it was one of those things of like right idea, wrong place, or just like wrong format, wrong way of connecting people. And that was a challenge. There are definitely more of those. I will keep thinking. We may have to circle back to that, but there's definitely more in there.
Well, but you just made a really good point, though, about the fact that just because it didn't work out there doesn't mean it wouldn't work out somewhere else. But that all goes back to having to have the knowledge of where you're working and who you're working with, and what kind of what's the population like there, as far as like, is this even something that these kinds of people would be interested in?
Totally. And I think actually programming is probably a really good example of that. And that what sells in New York isn't necessarily going to sell in rural Yorkshire, where I'm based. And like even in the UK, like if you move 2 cities, the audience appetite changes massively. So programs will completely differ, which is always a massive challenge. But yeah, and then that's also project-wise, the way your audience works. There's lots of things around there. I like the idea of experimenting and finding out, because you get really rapid feedback, and it's really tempting to play things safe. I know it's easier said than done, and from going back like my organization, like if things went wrong, I would be bankrupt. So I appreciate there's like actual genuine real life stresses in these scenarios. But I think having that experiment is quite interesting. There's someone a cellist called Jamie Walton, who runs a music festival relatively nearby to me. And he puts on it's the middle of rural Yorkshire. Like there are fields for miles around it, and it's just farmers and no classical music history audience there, but puts on like this summer festival with mad programming, and we'll do like 4 concerts back to back of Schoenberg sort of territory, where like this is like the appetite here is like the most cheesy of cheesy, like popular hits type scenario. And he tells a story of one of the farmers coming up to him afterwards, after a Schoenberg concert, and was like, I hated every second of that. I'll see you next week. And like, he had that buy-in that like people will just come and try stuff, and if they hate it, that's fine. They'll come back because they like it as an experiment or whatever it is. And then that's quite a journey to get to. But I think getting to those points with your audience where they're that comfortable experimenting with you is a wonderful goal to have.